Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to this ProCopywriters webinar. We're delighted to have Richard Shotton back for a second session. And if you haven't checked out Richard's book, The Choice Factory, I recommend picking up a copy. It's such an interesting book. I've ended up with 2 copies, partly because I bought the Kindle version first and then found I really needed one that I could kind of flick through and have on my desk and turn down the corners of certain pages. So you definitely recommend picking up his book. Yeah, and today he's going to be talking about how we can apply behavioral science. So yeah, over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much. As mentioned, this session is going to be, we're going to be about 50 minutes long, and I'm going to talk about how behavioural science can be applied practically. One of the reasons I wrote The Choice Factory was I was slightly frustrated that there was lots and lots of discussion about biases and discussion about psychology experiments, but I didn't feel there was enough focus on how do you practically apply these findings in marketing, how do you practically apply them in your day-to-day job. So that's what I want to do today. Now I want to start though in a slightly different place, and I want to show you an illusion. So it's called the Ebbinghaus illusion. It's a very famous illusion, and what it demonstrates is that you've got 2 orange dots there, 2 equally sized orange dots, but they appear to be a different size dependent on what is surrounding them. So when the orange dot's surrounded by big blue dots, it appears small. When it's surrounded very closely with small blue dots, it appears larger. So it's an illusion first noted back in the 1890s by a man called Hermann von Ebbinghaus. And I wanted to discuss this for 2 reasons. Firstly, because of its age. This is 130 years old, and it's as effective today as it was then. But the second reason is that I wanted to show that something that's very abstract like this can become much more practical. And it becomes practical because it acts as inspiration to see where else this idea of relativity applies. So von Ebbinghaus showed that what the size of objects, how we perceive how big they are, is a relative thing. It depends on what they're being compared to. It becomes interesting as it then stimulates psychologists to think, well, is something like price the same? Does price depend on the sense of value? Does it depend on what an item's being compared to? And I did some very simple experiments, for example, where I showed people mid-market coffees or teas or beers, and when they were compared to premium items in that category, they appeared great value. When they were compared to cheaper items in that category, they appeared poor value. So people's perception of an item was not determined by the inherent characteristics of the items, it was determined by what that item was compared to. So that was a slightly pedestrian example, a very literal application of this idea of relativity that I took and applied to price. Where these ideas become really interesting is when people apply a bit of creativity to the idea, where they see the experiment not as the end point, but just as a springboard for our lateral thinking. And it's one such example that I want to take you through. And this builds on the idea that consumers are too busy, they're inundated with too many decisions to weigh prices and value up logically, that they don't walk around thinking they're prepared to pay £1 per unit of happiness, whether it's for a can of Coke or a mobile phone. That would be a ludicrously complex calculation. And because people have too many calculations to make, they switch that complex calculation for a much simpler one. So they say to themselves, when they're trying to work out if an item's good value or not, what did I pay for something similar in the past? Now that should interest marketers because it means that this idea of value is a relative, not an absolute concept. That you can change consumers' willingness to pay for your product by orders of magnitude if you can shift the comparison set. Now, a number of brands have done this in the past. Red Bull's done it, craft beer's doing it currently. Sipsmith, I think, is a great example of it. But I would argue the best example is still probably Nespresso. Now, if you think back to when Nespresso launched, If it was a lesser team than Nestle, I think they'd have launched in something like this. You know, they'd have put their coffee in those half-kilo bags that you see on Sainsbury's or Tesco's, and tried to sell it that way. Now, if they had tried to do that, and if they charged the same per gram price that they do today, the cost of a 474 gram bag of Nespresso would be about £50. Now, I would argue there is no way on God's earth anyone in their right mind would possibly push aside a £5, £6 bag of Dow Egberts and take home a similar sized bag of Nespresso sitting next to it for £50. They just wouldn't do it. It would feel completely wasteful. But of course, what Nespresso did was something rather different. They didn't launch in bags like roast and ground coffee. They launched in pods. A pod gives you a cup-size serving of coffee. And once consumers start thinking of cups of coffee, their comparison set changes. It's no longer Dow Egberts, it's no longer Cafe Direct. Suddenly they're thinking of Starbucks or Cafe Nero. And here, the 50p that Nespresso want for a lungo pot of coffee looks remarkably good value compared to the £2.80 to the £2.90 that Cafe Nero want. But 50p for a pod, £50 for a bag, it's exactly the same per gram price. One feels a complete rip-off, one feels a bargain. All because of this very simple application of a well-known bias that has its roots back as far as 1890. And Nespresso have made hundreds of millions of pounds from that smart application, that creative and smart and repeated application. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that it is only these big, grand launches where we see price relativity or behavioural science in action. Once you're aware of the bias, once you're aware of the insight, you can start to see that people are applying it on all sorts of different levels. Yes, in the design and launch of products, but also in far more tactical areas, things like promotions. Rory Sutherland pointed out that Marks and Spencer's wonderful dine-in for two for £10. That's an example of price relativity. Is that offer a good deal or not? Well, a bottle of wine, a couple of microwave meals for a tenner, it sounds reasonably good value. It sounds reasonably good value if you're comparing it to, other items in the shop. But by calling it dine-in for two, you're suddenly changing the comparison set to takeaways or dining out. You're changing the comparison set to Pizza Express or Domino's. And suddenly £10 looks remarkably good value when you've changed your comparison set. So the key with all these biases is to take the underlying principle and then change how you apply it according to the situation you're in. And I'll just finish with one final example, which I saw on Twitter recently, which I thought was rather good. And it's actually from Trojan condoms and trying to get people to change the competitive set when weighing up whether they're good value. So it's one of my favourite examples. Why bother comparing yourself to other condoms? Far better to compare yourself with Huggies diapers and the expense that would bring. It's a lovely, creative example of someone applying on a very day-to-day basis a very well-known simple bias. But that brings me back to a bit of a problem. We started off by saying that the Ebbinghaus illusion was from the 1890s. There's been 130 years worth of psychology experiments since then. There are literally thousands upon thousands of psychology experiments. So that is one of the best things about behavioural science. It means that whatever problem you're facing, there will be a relevant bias that you can apply to tackle that problem. So it's great on that respect. But on the other hand, there's a bit of a problem in that there are so many of these experiments. Where do you start? It can be a deeply confusing, deeply complex category. And I think that explains a lot about why people don't apply this as much as they should, because it feels too much like hard work. It feels too confusing, too off-putting. So the best way, I would argue to you today, the best way for you to navigate that confusion, navigate that complexity, is to use a framework. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of frameworks out there. There's Mindspace, there's Combi. I don't think it really matters too much which framework you use, but you've got to use a framework, I think, or you've got to pick one of them, whichever works for you best, to help you categorize the biases and make it much, much easier to apply. So I was going to take you through a framework, and the framework that I was going to discuss was one called EAST. And EAST is the framework that the Behavioural Insights team developed about 6 or 7 years ago. And it's an acronym. So each of the letters in EAST stands for a principle. So that is make it easy, make it attractive, make it social, make it timely. And I thought we could go through each of those principles. Now, in the interest of time, we have to be quite quick, but we're going to go quickly through the principle, then give you one, maybe two examples about some of the nuances to that principle, how it's applied, and then we'll go through the others. And hopefully that shows the benefit of these types of framework. So where I wanted to begin was, take them out of order slightly, but I wanted to begin with the simplest, which is the idea of make it social. Now, what the Behavioural Insights team mean here is make it social. It's got nothing to do with social media. This is nothing to do with Twitter, nothing to do with Instagram. This is about social proof. It's the idea that if you can show that a behaviour is popular or commonplace, it will become more popular still. That when people are making decisions, they don't make those decisions as discrete, atomized individuals. They look around, whether they admit it or not, they look around to what other people are doing and are influenced by that. Now, the most famous study in this area, the most famous piece of evidence, is probably the experiment by Robert Cialdini. So he was the professor of marketing and psychology at Arizona State University, and he ran an experiment about towel reuse at hotels, which some of you may have heard of. So he worked with a hotel chain in Southwest USA. He persuaded that hotel chain to let him randomly change the messages that they were using to encourage people to reuse towels. So he had 3 different messages randomly allocated across different rooms. The first message was the control message, and here it said, please reuse your towel because it's good for the environment. And in that scenario, 35% of people reuse their towel. Then in the next set of rooms, he dropped all that kind of logic, all that rational messaging, and instead replaced it with a social proof message. He made it very clear what the norm of behavior was. So he said in the second group of rooms, please reuse your towels because most guests do so. And in that scenario, reuse rates went up from 35% to 44%. So it went up by 9 percentage points or 25%. So a significant change in behavior, especially considering all the kind of the logic and rational reasons for changing behavior being removed. Then in the third and final group of rooms, Cialdini ran another message. This time he wanted to test the principle that it's not the absolute scale that is important in Make It Social and social proof. It's making sure that we think people like us have behaved in a certain way. So he tries to make a very, very tenuous link with the audience, and he goes out and says on his message, please reuse your towels because most guests who've stayed in this particular room have done so. And in that scenario, he saw the most effective behavior change. He saw 49% of people reusing their towel on a day-to-day basis. So a full 40% improvement from the control. So this is certainly not a rogue finding. You know, we've had lots and lots of experience proving social proof. Fang's shown it in restaurants. Duncan Watts has shown it with music downloads. Christakis has shown it with the beast in smoking. The HMRC have shown it with tax repayment rates. So it is a robust finding which repeats again and again. And to be fair, quite a few brands will apply this. They will apply it, though, in a very literal manner. They will often go out and say that they are, Britain's favourite lager, or they're an Amazon bestseller, or their chocolate bars sell 1 million bars a month. And that's all well and good, but with all these biases, the key thing, as I mentioned, is taking the underlying principle and not seeing that as the end point, but seeing it as a springboard for our strengths of creative thinking, of lateral thinking. And if you do that, then the rewards are much, much greater. So one example of that for social proof would be around creating through design, or through, it could have been through copy, in this case through design, creating a sense of popularity long before that popularity existed. And the example, I think the best example of this is probably iPod. So if you think back to 2001, when iPod launched, they were not first to market. There were many other brands who launched MP3 players before them. But every other brand, their success was essentially invisible. No one had a clue about how popular Motorola or Sony was, because the MP3 would live in that person's pocket when they were listening to it, and they all had interchangeable black earphones. You had no idea the brand that was being listened to. What Apple did so brilliantly was not just focus on the design of their hardware itself, the iPod, but they focused on the design of the very visible earphones, the earbuds. In all their Try It Day advertising, they made a big play of the whiteness of the earbuds, the distinctive white color. And that meant that every time you saw someone listening to an iPod, you knew, anyone with white earbuds, you knew they were listening to Apple. And so its success, its prevalence was very visible, whereas competitors, their success was invisible. So they felt like they were, or they looked like they were, the market leader long before they were. So that was, I think, a lateral creative use of this idea of social proof, appearing popular maybe long before you were. Because people aren't natural statisticians. They're not actually going to do big research about finding out who's the most popular. It's design cues like that that can do a lot of the job. Now, before we move away from social proof, I just want to go back to the Cialdini experiment for a little bit, because the key findings from that town experiment are reasonably well known. What's quite interesting and less well known, though, is that Cialdini actually ran a follow-up experiment. And in his follow-up experiment, he recruited people to take part in a more standard research approach. He sent them out a survey, and in that survey, one of the questions he asked was, he said, look at these 3 messages that you might see in a hotel room that might try and encourage you to reuse your towel. And he gave them the environmental message that we've talked about, the social proof message, and the tailored social proof message. And he said to people, which do you think would motivate you to change your behavior most? And the overwhelming favorite was the environmental message. Now, remember, when he observed people's behavior, when he actually looked at what they did when no one thought anyone was watching, most people were influenced by the tailored social proof message. But that is not how they claimed other people claimed they would behave. People said that it would be the environmental message that would be the most effective. Now, that, I think, is another reason why behavioural science often doesn't get traction in organisations. It's because too often people test messages by directly asking consumers how they think they behave. The problem with that is one of the key findings, the most repeated findings in social psychology, is that people are do not know their true motivations. There's a wonderful psychologist called Wilson at the University of Virginia who says we are strangers to ourselves. So if you ask someone, it's not that they will necessarily lie, although that is a danger in certain cases. What's more likely is they will just try and concoct on the spot. They don't really know what would actually motivate them, so they concoct a plausible rationalization of their behavior. And the problem with that is that they often overemphasize certain drivers of behavior. They overemphasize logic, they overemphasize price, they overemphasize pro-social behavior. So if you are thinking of testing some of these behavioral science ideas, the key thing is not to go out and ask people what might motivate them when you're trying to test your ideas. The better thing to do is set up experiments like Cialdini did, where you have a test and control version. You keep all variables the same except for one, and then you attribute any difference in the level of behavior change to that small change. And it will give you a far more accurate indication into human behavior. So that was the first principle, so the most straightforward one, this idea of making it social. The next area I wanted to talk about was about making it easy. And this is an idea that is probably most widely espoused by a man called B.J. Fogg. And Fogg argues that marketers, people interested in behavior change, are too fixated with changing consumers' motivation. And he says, yes, that is important, but actually making something easier, removing barriers to behavior, is just as important a lever. But he argues too often it gets ignored, maybe it doesn't feel as grand or as important, or some of these barriers feel too inconsequential to be important, that it ends up being ignored. And people fixate too much on motivation. Now, there's a lovely report called that the Behavioural Insights team did recently called Behavioural Government. And within that, they have quite a dramatic example about how those seeking to change behaviour overestimate motivation or and underestimate ease. So the experiment in question is by Bergman and Rogers, and they came up with this experiment while working with the Department of Education. And in 2017, the Department of Education had created an offering for parents where you could sign up, you would be sent every day or every couple of days text messages, and these text messages would give you tips and advice on how to encourage your children to revise, work, do their homework and learn at home. And it was a very successful offering, brilliant piece of content. People who signed up for it saw a 10% improvement in their children's grades. That's a big change in performance. Now, what Bergman and Rogers did, though, that was clever, was they persuaded the Department of Education to let them trial different ways of promoting the campaign to see the effect on sign-up. So they set up 3 different sign-up processes. The standard process, was the complicated, difficult one. And here people were texted details of the free offering and said, if you want to sign up, go to this website, and then they had to fill in a form, page worth of details. And when they did that, 1% of people took them up on the offer. The next way they launched it was what's called the simplified version, the easier version, where they gave people exactly the same information about the content, but this time said, if you want to start, just text us back the word start. And in that scenario, 8% of people signed up. So that was 8 times as many people signed up when that one hurdle of removing a form was taken away from the equation. And then the third and final version, they had an auto enrollment. They gave people the same, they texted the same information to people, a different group of matched nationally represented people. They texted them the same information, but this time they said, you are enrolled, and if you don't want to be enrolled, all you have to do is text us back the word stop. So people were auto-enrolled. And in that scenario, 96% of people signed up. So you've got a spread of 95 percentage points between the easy version and the hard version. But then what was clever was not just this demonstration about how small bits of friction have a large effect on award-winning content. What they then did was they went and found experts in teaching, head teachers, and they said to them, look, this is the way we're going to launch this service, what proportion of people do you think will sign up in each scenario? They gave them the standard, simplified and auto enrollment scenarios. And experts were wildly off. They imagined that in the standard sign-up process, 39% of people would sign up, 46% in the simplified version, 66% in the auto enrollment. So they didn't envisage a spread of 95 percentage points. They thought it'd just be much tighter, 27%. Now, here yes, they got the direction right. They knew that if you added in barriers, it would put people off. But they were wildly wrong in terms of the scale of the effect. Now, what Bergen and Rogers argue, and I think this is as true for marketing departments as it is for the Department of Education, is that if people underestimate the importance of these small barriers, almost by definition, what will end up happening is that people will put too much time, energy and effort and money into improving the content and changing motivation, and too little emphasis into removing those tiny bits of friction in the sign-up process. Now, the boring but important implication of this is that you need to make the sign-up process, you need to make purchasing as simple as possible. So whether that's radically simplifying the sign-up journey, pre-populating forms, moving people from buying actively to subscriptions, all of those are important steps. But what behavioural science also shows us, and we've only got time to go into kind of one of these ideas, is that yes, there are those intuitive, simple ways of making things easier, but there are also less intuitive ways, more counterintuitive approaches. There are things like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea that the language that you use when describing a potential approach can make people more or less likely to sign up. There's an idea called choice paralysis, that sometimes the best way to make something easy is to reduce the amount of options you give people. So lots and lots of different, I think, clever ways of making something easy that you can get from behavioural science. But the one I wanted to focus on today was an interesting experiment called the foot in the door technique. And this experiment comes from two American psychologists called Friedman and Fraser. And they were interested in how do you make big bits of hard, behavior change, how do you make them more likely to happen? And their approach was to use something called the foot in the door technique. So their original experiment back in the 60s, in the mid 60s, was they went around a American neighborhood, knocked on people's doors and said, please, can you be a good citizen and put up this giant 14-foot square sign in your garden saying, drive slowly. Now, most people do not want a big ugly sign in their front garden, so only 17% of people accepted and put up the signs. What the psychologists then did was try a different tactic. So that was their control group. In the test group, they tried a two-pronged approach. They went and saw the other households 2 weeks earlier, and they said to them, please, can you put up this tiny little sticker in your window saying, please drive carefully. Now, a little sticker, 2 or 3 inches long. And virtually everyone accepts. Now, they then go back 2 weeks later with their giant signs, knock on the doors of everyone who's put up the sticker in their window, and they say to them, will you put up this big sign to encourage safe driving? And in that scenario, 76% of people who've put up the sticker accept the giant sign. So you've got almost, well, no, slightly, I think, yeah, slightly more than 3 times as many people will accept and put up this giant sign when their two-step process has been used. What the psychologist argued was that why this worked so well was that people want to be consistent with their past behavior. So when they came around knocking on their door with their giant signs the second time, people looked back at their past behaviour, saw that they were the type of people who put stickers up in their windows, they're the type of person who helps out with societal issues, and then they felt they needed to be consistent with that, therefore they put up the sign. So the psychologists called this the foot in the door technique, and it was the argument that if you have a very hard piece of behaviour change that you need to encourage, maybe it's giving up smoking or make a radical change to your lifestyle, the best thing to do is to split it into this two-step process. Get people to make the smallest possible change that makes them feel like they're the type of person that you want them to be, and then follow up with a bigger ask. So you might want to think about that in terms of the projects you've got on. If you've got a really tricky piece of behavior change that you're trying to encourage people to do, don't do it in one go. Think about this two-step foot in the door process. So that was make it easy. So essentially this idea that marketers, the people who are interested in behavior change, fixate too much on motivation, and let's start putting more time, energy and effort into making the desired behavior as easy as possible. But let's now move on to the third part of the EASE framework, and this is make it attractive. Now this falls into two areas. The first area is, how do you attract someone's attention? There is an argument that we see hundreds, if not thousands, of commercial messages each day. So just being noticed is one of our biggest hurdles, and one that we should probably put more emphasis on after we jump too quickly to the next stage. Now, there is an idea that I'm going to talk about called the von Restorff effect, which gives us one particular tactic for getting attention. But before we do that, I want to show you a genuine poster from a festival, and it's from a heavy metal festival in America. And all I want you to do is think, well, what is the first band on this poster that you notice? Here you go. Here's the poster. And what people tend to say is either they notice one of the very big bands, huge writing, or they notice Party Cannon in the bottom right-hand corner. Now, Party Cannon, this is a genuine death metal band from Dunfermline. What I think they've realised is something that eludes 90% of brands, that we notice that which is distinctive, that which stands out. Now, that is not a finding limited to heavy metal bands. It's not even a recent finding. The person that first came up with this idea was someone called von Restorff, Hedwig von Restorff. So along with Hermann von Ebbinghaus, probably the most ridiculously named psychologist out there. Now, Hedwig von Restorff, in her initial experiment back in 1933, she gave people long lists of information. So there were 3 bits of information on each line. So she might start off with ABC, ZYP, RJS, and then she would throw in numbers, 174, and then she would go back to letters. After a while, she'd take away these lists of information, and she would ask people to recall as much as they could. And her key finding was that people remember that which is distinctive. So they remember the numbers in long lists of letters, they remember the letters in long lists of numbers. So that became known as the isolation effect, or the von Restorff effect, named after her. Now, yes, that's an 80-odd-year-old finding, but it works just as well today. I ran an experiment in 2016 with a colleague, Laura McLean, and we reran von Restorff's experiment, and we found people were up to 30 times more likely to remember that which was distinctive. And what's interesting here is you could argue, well, wait a minute, do we really need behavioural science for this? Don't most agencies, don't most copywriters, don't most creative directors, don't they already know this? Well, I think, yes, most agencies worth their salt do know this, but it's no good knowing something. We've all got to also persuade either people in our organisation or in client organisations to agree with us. And in this instance, where behavioural science is useful is not necessarily in telling us something new, it's in getting us to become more persuasive when arguing the case. Because if you look out at most adverts, what you'll notice is that the majority, cling pretty tightly to category conventions. We are not successful at the moment in persuading our colleagues or our clients to behave distinctively. And I wonder, and Martin Weigel writes about this very interestingly, I wonder if part of the reason for that is the poor psychology of how we try and sell distinctive work in. That we often go to clients and say, look, be brave, take a risk, deviate from your category norms. And as Martin Weigel says, that is bad psychology, because what the client is hearing is take a risk. What they're hearing when they hear those words is, well, if this goes wrong, I might lose my job. Now, I don't want risky. That sounds dangerous and unreliable. I think we would be better at selling in more distinctive work if we didn't talk about it being risky, but instead talked about being distinctive as a very sensible, pragmatic weighing up of the probabilities. Don't argue it being about a creative leap, but say it's based on peer-reviewed academic evidence and insights into psychology from von Restorff and ever since. And if we argue it that way and talk about it being this sensible balancing the odds, I wonder if we might have more success in selling a distinctive work. So that was the first half of making it attractive. So how do you attract attention? But as I mentioned, there are two elements to make it attractive. The other part is that, how do you make a message attractive? And what psychologists and behavioural science argue is that, if you try and appeal to people's logical or rational side, and I know those are slightly troublesome words, but if you bear with me, but if you try and appeal to those sides, you tend to leave people cold, and that actually ads from a more emotional route or messages from a more emotional route are going to be more effective. Now, again, you could argue, well, wait a minute, don't we already know this? We've got the amazing work from Binet and Field that have proved the superiority of emotional pleas over rational ones using the IPA data bank. Now, great as that work is, that only sets up the task. It doesn't tell you how to make a message as appealing or as attractive as possible. And I think one of the best things about behavioural science is that not only does it tell you what you should do, it tells you the best way of doing it. And here, one of the most, some of the ways that it's done are often quite counterintuitive. So I thought what might be useful is take you through one counterintuitive example from behavioural science that shows us how to make a message as appealing as possible. And the area that I wanted to talk about was the work of this man, Elliot Aronson. So Aronson was the professor of psychology at Harvard in the 1960s. And in 1966, he runs his classic experiment, the pratfall effect. He recruits a colleague of his, and he persuades that colleague to take part in a quiz. Now, Aronson gives his colleague all the answers, so the contestant, does amazingly well, gets 92% of the questions right, wins the quiz by miles, looks like a genius. But then as the quiz is drawing to a close, Aronson asks the contestant, or is told the contestant beforehand, to make a small mistake. And so the contestant spills a cup of coffee down himself. Aronson has recorded all of this, and he then takes that recording and plays it to people. And he either plays them the entire incident, so great performance and spillage, or he edits out the spillage so people only hear the amazing quiz performance. He then questions these participants, these listeners, as to how appealing they find the contestant. And all the metrics of appeal that Aronson asks about, people find the contestant significantly more appealing if they've heard the mistake as well as the great performance. So Aronson calls this the pratfall effect. It's the idea that people or products who exhibit a flaw become more appealing. Now, if you think about the greatest ever ads, not the run-of-the-mill ads, but the greatest ever ads, it's interesting how many of them have used this insight. Now you go back to 1959 and Bill Bernbach and DDB, and you've got the fantastic VW campaign launching the Beetle in America, where they had the wonderful line, "Ugly is only skin deep." The campaign was built on the admission, the open admission of the Beatles' flaws. A slightly less famous ad, this time I think written by Bob Levinson, they talked about the car being slow. And if you look down the bottom left, there's a lovely little bit of copy from Bob Levinson where he says, you can tell them from Volkswagens because a VW won't go over 72 miles an hour. And this is my favourite bit, even though the speedometer shows a wildly optimistic top speed of 90. So they told people the car was ugly. They told them that it was slow. Same agency, 3 years later, this time written by Paula Green, they told people that Avis was unpopular. You know, we're number two. We're number two, so we try harder. Or you've got Listerine, the taste you hate twice a day. Guinness, good things come to those who wait. They told people it was slow. Stella, reassuringly expensive. They went out and emphasised their priciness. Cream cakes, naughty but nice. They talked about how highly calorific they were. Now, again and again, the greatest brands have emphasised a flaw, emphasised a weakness. Bring it a bit more up to date. You've got some examples in America at the moment where I've seen a few examples of people running negative reviews. And this one is for the Snowbird Ski Resort in Colorado. Stretching it to breaking point, there's the Hans Brinker Budget Hotel. A phenomenal campaign from the Netherlands where they revel in the poor customer service that they offer. Now, I think what these brands have realized is that there are three big strengths to admitting a weakness. First, you get over the problem of believability. You know, one of the biggest problems in terms of advertising is customers do not trust advertising. And of course they don't, because we have a vested interest in telling a very positive story about our brand. So you've got this big problem of noticeability, and then even if you do get noticed, your claims are unlikely to be believed. The brilliant thing about the pratfall effect, the brilliant thing about an admission of a flaw, is that you have tangibly demonstrated your honesty by mentioning that flaw. And that means all your other claims become that much more believable. The second strength is this approach controls where consumers think your flaw lies. There is an argument, there's some work by Northwest University which suggests that consumers do not believe that any brand is perfect. They know in life there are always trade-offs. There's nothing such as a free lunch. So if you try and pretend that you're perfect, you don't persuade the consumer that you're perfect. All you do is leave them slightly uncertain. They don't know where your flaw lies. And therefore, there's a slight nagging doubt in the back of their minds that that flaw might be in a very important area. So therefore, they don't want to use your brand. So the second great bit of admitting a weakness is you control where your flaw lies. And if you're sensible, you pick somewhere quite inconsequential. And then the third strength of these admission of the flaws is that the best brands don't admit a flaw randomly. They're very, very careful about what they admit a flaw to. So VW, for example, admits that it's ugly, but then they use that admission to build on their greatest strength, which is, look, yes, we are ugly, but that's because we don't care about aesthetic fripperies. We, unlike our competitors, are concerned with engineering excellence. So they've recognized that flaws have mirror strengths. Or Listerine. Or there's an even better version of Listerine. There's one called Buckley. It's worth looking at if you can Google that online. They've done some amazing copy around cough syrup. But both those brands recognize that, yes, we taste awful. But what do you expect from a potent medicine? That again, there's a mirror strength to that weakness of bad taste. Even Hans Brinker, I think there's an element of, yes, we're a dive, but by God, you're going to have a good time. So with the pratfall effect, what you should be thinking is, well, look, what is the strength of the brand that I'm working with? What's its core strength? And is there a mirror weakness that we could omit that will both make our message more believable and control where that flaw lies, but also, most importantly, it will emphasize our core strength. So that's one way in which behavioral science gives us tactics to make a message more attractive or more appealing, but there are lots and lots of others. The final area that I wanted to discuss was the idea of making it timely. And this is the idea that the impact and effectiveness of a message will depend on when we see it. So there are lots and lots of examples about this. This idea's got the fresh start effect, which is about how people are more open to behavior change at the beginning of new time periods. There's arguments about people are more open to behavior change at the beginning of habits. But where I wanted to focus on was this idea, 9 enders. And it's an idea that comes from a researcher called Adam Alter at NYU. And Alter argues that people are particularly likely to make big behavior change when their age is approaching the turn of a decade. So when their age ends in 9, what he calls a 9-ender. So when you're 29, 39, 49. So he says, if you want to change behavior, people are much more likely to listen to your message and act upon it when your age ends in 9. Now, if you, like me, when I first heard this, I thought, okay, sounds kind of logical-ish. I guess, we put more emphasis on, turning 40 and 50 than we do on other years. So therefore, it kind of makes sense that as we approach those decades, we'll think through how our life's going, and if it's going badly, we will make big changes. But Alter didn't stop there. He didn't argue, and this is one thing that psychologists do. They don't argue something from logic alone. They will put in a number of experiments to try and prove their point. And Alter was particularly inventive with his experiments. So he looked at a number of different data sets. He looked at affairs. So he looked at Ashley Madison data, an affair website, and saw that men were 18% more likely to sign up to that website when their age ends in 9. He looked at marathon data and saw that first-time marathon runners were 18% more, 48%, oh gosh, I'm getting the wrong way around. So I think it was 18 for Ashley Madison and 48% for first-time marathon runners. They were 40% more likely to sign up for a marathon when their age ends in 9 for the first time. He even looked at American suicide data and saw there was a small but statistically significant uplift in suicides when ages end in 9. So why I wanted to mention this one is, firstly, it's a great opportunity, this targeting of 9-enders, to reach people when their habits are in flux. So if you're a diet brand, if you're trying to stop people smoking, if you want to sell long-haul holidays, you want to sell open-top convertibles, this might be a audience that you could target who are more likely to switch the product you're offering, but your competitors are probably not targeting. And that's important because we're in an auction-based media landscape. You're not going to get a bargain if other people are bidding on the same information. So it's a way to behave differently from your competitors. But where I thought might be the best place to end the presentation is about the power of endings. And I think that's an interesting angle on this idea of make it timely. And this idea comes from work by Kahneman and Radelmeyer. And they recognize that people cannot possibly remember all elements of their experience. Now, you can't remember every moment from a trip to the pub. You won't remember every moment from this webinar. You won't remember every moment from the next holiday you go on. People do not remember everything, because if they did, they would be swamped and overwhelmed with information, and they would grind to a halt. So Kahneman and Radelmeyer began to think, well, if people can't remember everything, what are the moments that are disproportionately likely to be remembered? And bizarrely, the first place they turned to test this idea, or to work out what moments people remembered, was colonoscopy patients. So colonoscopies are a deeply unpleasant 15-minute medical procedure, and Kahneman and Radermeyer took 600 patients, genuine patients going for genuine operations, gave them a handheld device which would buzz every minute, and then every minute they had to record on a little dial from 0, it being in no pain at all, to 10, loads of pain. So Kahneman and Radermeyer got 15 readings per patient. Later, once the operation's over, Kahneman and Radermeyer question the patient and get them to give a single rating on how they thought the operation, how painful the operation was, from 0 to 10 again. And they go back a month later with the same question. Then they compare what they call the data from the experiencing self, you know, those 10 ratings, 15 ratings in the moment, to the remembering self, those final 2 questions. And what they found is there was very little correlation between the total amount of pain, you know, that is the units of pain multiplied by the time they were felt for, and people's recollection of how painful the event was. Actually, the far better guides to people's memories was how good or bad the final moment of the experience was, and how good or bad the best and worst moments of the experience were. And Kahneman and Radermeyer do a lot of other tests and a lot of other areas that show these 2 factors, you know, the peak and the end, are the best determinants of what, or the most things that are most likely to be remembered. So they call this the peak-end rule. Now you might be thinking that what the hell has colonoscopies got to do with marketing and where this can possibly help us. But as I've been saying all along, with all these experiments, the experiments and the finding are just the raw fodder for us to then come up with ideas. And if you think about the peak-end rule, you know, forget the colonoscopy part, but if you think about it as a rule for creating good customer experiences, then suddenly there are many ways you can use it. Now, I want to take you through one example. So this is one of my favorites. This is from the Magic Castle Hotel in America. So Chip and Dan Heath write about this in their book, The Power of Moments. And it's a slightly strange hotel in that it's a little bit shabby on the outside, you know, very 70s decor, small pool, small rooms. And despite that, it's quite expensive. So when I tried to book a room, they want, I think, 254 quid. I gave them about 2 months notice, 254 quid for a night. So it's expensive, and on some objective levels, not that great. Yet despite that, if you look at TripAdvisor, then if you're amazed, the reviews are amazing. 94% of people, and this isn't a small sample issue, there's 3,500 ratings. 3,500 ratings, 94% of them rate it as very good or excellent. That is the second highest in Los Angeles. Only one other hotel beats it. Now, the reason that it beats far more prestigious hotels, far more expensive hotels, far more better value hotels, the reason it does so well is they are masters of applying the peak-end rule. What they have realized is that if you try and do everything quite well, you know, you just end up frittering away your finite budget. What you should do is focus on 1 or 2 moments of excellence and invest in those and focus your creative output on those, because it's the 1 or 2 things that get remembered. So rather than, you know, fritting away their budget on painting the rooms a bit more regularly, doing a bit more staff training, decorating the rooms a bit more regularly, what they do instead is pick 1 or 2 great moments to work on. And I just want to take you through one of those. So that is the Popsicle Helpline. So it's a lovely idea. It's one of these peak experiences. What they do is they have a red-handled, old-fashioned phone by the pool. You can pick that up 24 hours a day, speak to the guy on the other side, and he will come out with as many free ice lollies for you and your kids as you want. And he comes out, this lovely silver platter, big dome over your ice lollies, and he's dressed up to the nines and gives you your selection of ice lollies. Now that, to me, is a brand applying a behavioural science insight. They aren't trying to do everything quite well. They're doing one thing excellently. Now, it'd be even better if they did that at the final moment of the experience. You know, final moment of a holiday is normally pretty drab. You pay, you hang around, you settle up. It's not a great experience. What Kahneman and Radermeyer would suggest is that you should focus on that moment if you want to shape memories. And they're certainly being successful in shaping memories at the moment, just with the Popsicle helpline. If you look at the TripAdvisor reviews, most of them, I reckon about half, 2/3, mention the Popsicle helpline. Now, what I love about this idea is not only if you use it in your day-to-day work, trying to create customer experiences in the copy that you write, in the experiences that you lay on, that not only will you be basing your approach on well-known behavioural science, and it's given you the best chance of success, also there's a wonderful pragmatism to it. Because I think if you focus on just doing one thing excellently, you're more likely to get a better response from the creative agency you're working with. Because if you go to them and say, make our customer experience the best there is, where do you start with that brief? But if you go to them and say, well, we want you to make the experience of leaving our hotel the best in class, well, suddenly you've got a tight brief. As David Ogilvy said, give me the freedom of a tight brief. You give people that very specific moment to make excellent, then suddenly you've got a far better chance of getting great work. Now that has been a very, very quick tour. As I said, there's 130 years of history of behavioural science. There are thousands of biases. I've certainly not gone into them in huge depth or covered all of them. But what hopefully you'll take from this is firstly that behavioural science can be very practically applied to solving your problems. And then secondly, if you want to use behavioural science, you need to use a framework. My recommendation is maybe start with the EAST framework. It's publicly available. You can download it online. Just Google BIT EAST framework. Download that. They've got a lovely guide to using it, and there's a wonderful book called Inside the Nudge Unit, which also helps you apply it. So I hope that piqued your interest. And if you have any questions at all, I think we have a couple of minutes left. I would love to answer them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that was amazing. And so we haven't got a huge amount of time, but anyone, if you have any questions, you can type them into the questions panel it should be on the right-hand side of your screen. We have one question already from Liz Bell, who was wondering, with that example you gave with the different sign-up options, you had the simplified, standard, and then auto-enroll. And so Liz was just wondering, was the auto-enroll model kind of risky because people end up enrolled against their kind of they're not really interested, they're just there by default because they couldn't be bothered to unsubscribe.
So I think that is a very good point. Now you could argue there are different cases when all that matters is enrollment, and others where actually you need another behavior. So I would argue there's two different auto-enrollment cases that are often trotted out. One success, one less so. And those are organ donations and pensions. So in pensions, it doesn't really matter if people's attitude towards pension when they're in auto-enroll doesn't get any better or worse. Unless they actively overrule it, their money is going into their pension. And we've seen that there's been huge success in increasing pension rates when companies had to move from having their staff actively opt in to now everyone opt in by default. So in that case, opt-in works very well. With organ donation, the jury is out a bit more, because what it does very successfully is if you move from asking people to actively sign up to an organ register, and there are lots of countries that do that, and most countries are between 5 and 20% of people actively register. If you switch to a default, an opt-in one, suddenly your rate will jump up to 90, 95%, maybe slightly higher actually. And there again, there are lots of countries that have shown that. Most countries that are default opt-in are around 95%. But that isn't like the pension example. Success is not getting people on that register. Success is what happens when someone has died, do those organs actually end up being used elsewhere? And unfortunately, I think the evidence is a little bit less conclusive, because what seems to happen is that if you have actively opted in, families are less likely to overrule that decision. They're not, if their mother or sister or son or whoever has died and they know that person actively opted into a register, they will often let the organs be taken. If they think it's just a matter of default, they're much more likely to overrule. So I would argue with the case of defaults, it really depends what you need. Is it about getting actual enrolments or a change of behaviour? So it definitely varies. I think that's an excellent point.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. So we'd better wrap it up there because we are out of time. But yeah, we did have some other questions we haven't had a chance to get to. Very sorry about that.
Apologies.
Yeah, no, well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Richard. This has been fascinating, and I think given everyone lots of ideas and probably lots of extra reading to do. And as you mentioned, so there's that book by is it the Behavioural Insights team?
Yes, the PDF you can download for free is by the Behavioural Insights team. So Google BIT East Framework, and the book is by the CEO of the Behavioural Insights team called David Halpern, Halpern. If you want a free thing, go for the download. If you don't mind spending a tenner, I would get the book. I think it's a much more engaging read.
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. And also, if you'd like to hear from Richard again, he is speaking at our copywriting conference in October. So yeah, do check that out. And I definitely recommend his book. Yeah, we've got lots more webinars lined up, so I hope you can join us for another one soon. Thanks again, Richard.